Historian Alan Taylor notes that in popular history books and film, a united and heroic American people rise up against unnatural foreign domination by Britons, all cast as snooty villains. He continues, that story of irrepressible nationalism inverts cause and effect in the Revolution. In reality, Taylor explains, the colonists were reluctant nationalists, and the Revolution began rather than culminated a long, slow, and incomplete process of creating an American identity and nation. America's nationalistic identity goes all the way back to the Revolution itself. After all, this is the moment Americans established themselves as the world's greatest superpower. It is the origin story, the defining struggle. But that origin story is also deeply problematic. Taylor warns that by describing the American Revolution as pitting Americans against the British, historians prematurely find a cohesive national identity. If we equate patriots with Americans, we recycle the canard that anyone who opposed the Revolution was an alien at heart. We also read American nationalism backwards, obscuring the divisions and uncertainties of the Revolutionary era. Nowhere is this problem more evident than in the story of African Americans. Whether they self-identified as patriot or loyalists, they were all Americans after the Declaration of Independence. Free blacks and enslaved people were forced to choose sides as well. Yet their decisions remain largely hidden from the historical record. Part of that silence came from the legal and social restrictions of the time, but part of it was deliberate. Taylor explains that to sustain support among war-weary people, patriot leaders had to make political concessions that promised greater respect and political power for common men, without mass participation. Patriots could not sustain riots and boycotts against British taxes or the later war against British and Loyalist troops. As it is today, revolutionary America was deeply divided. 1/3 supported independence, 1/3 remained loyal to Britain, and the final third believed their lives would not change no matter which flag flew above their heads. It was inside this divided society that politics determined the fate of Black Americans. What you will discover is this: they were overlooked, they were erased, and yet they were essential to both the beginning and the end of the Revolution. Recovering their buried stories is the work before us, and the importance of that work cannot be overstated. Historian Benjamin Quarles, who remains the most quoted authority on Black participation in the Revolution, wrote, "In the Revolutionary War, the American Negro was a participant and a symbol." You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon divergent moments within the African American community. Episode number 2, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Education Week notes that in today's classrooms, teaching Black history has become a challenge at best and a dangerous proposition at worst. The publication continues, in many states, politicians have demanded teachers alter their curriculum over fears that Black history instruction is driven by critical race theory or casts the American story in a negative light. The consequences for learning are immediate and tangible. With this increased scrutiny on Black history curriculum and instruction in schools, educators are often forced to make compromises at the expense of student learning. Ultimately, some teachers come to the decision that it's simply easier not to teach Black history at all. In these classrooms, all that remains is a stripped-down narrative. African American history is reduced to a sequence of isolated moments: slavery, the Civil War, the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement. This version of history neglects the reality that African Americans were present at every step of the nation's journey. Imagine how alienating American history becomes if your story is reduced to this: 200 years of slavery, followed by liberation granted by Northern white abolitionists. But the damage is not limited to black students. White students are denied something as well: the understanding that black and white Americans fought and died together, often for the same ideals. Ignoring race carries its own consequences. Loyola Marymount University scholar Lilla Rhodes explains that since the beginning of higher education, colleges and universities have functioned as gatekeepers of knowledge. These institutions have also functioned to exclude students of color from the academic process. She continues, Black students at primary white institutions today experience a difficult reality shaped by a history of isolation and discriminatory policies, in sharp contrast to the idealized version of inclusive and colorblind American college campuses. In my own experience, ignoring race reinforces a powerful assumption that the American Revolution was fought because of and for the benefit of white patriots alone. Malcolm X famously rejected that narrative, declaring, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us." Their absence from the Puritan founding stories of New England can be explained, but the absence of black voices from the story of the American Revolution cannot. That absence is the product of inherited racism, sometimes deliberate, often born from ignorance. I can say that with confidence, because I know the story of Crispus Attucks. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that Crispus Attucks is one of the most important figures in African American history, not for what he did for his own race, but what he did for all oppressed people everywhere. And historian Mitch Katchen calls Attucks the first martyr of liberty. And yet many Americans remain unaware of his role in helping spark the events that led to the Revolutionary War. Before explaining how and why he was erased, we must first understand who he was. The details of his early life are incomplete, but we know this. In 1750, a newspaper advertisement described Attucks as a runaway slave. The ad noted his height, 6'2", and observed curiously that he had knees nearer together than common. At some point, Attucks made his way to Boston and lived as a free man. He worked the docks, unloading cargo ships. He also served as a whaler. Boston Tea Party participant George Hughes later recalled him, though imperfectly, claiming Attucks was a Nantucket Indian with a distinct war whoop. That misidentification may have helped Attucks avoid recapture. There is also evidence he used the name Michael Johnson, a simple alias that helped him remain one step ahead of those who would have him return to slavery. The British officers who would later make him a martyr were never supposed to be in Boston at all. Years earlier, a young George Washington had unknowingly helped ignite the First Global War, the French and Indian War. When it ended, Britain faced staggering debt. Parliament expected the colonies to help foot the bill. Soon, new taxes were levied. That alone angered colonists. But Great Britain went further. To prevent future conflict with Native Americans, British officials banned colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, particularly the Ohio Valley, the very territory the war had been fought over. Colonists paid the cost of victory, but they were denied its rewards. Meanwhile, danger still surrounded them. Native resistance remained strong. Leaders like Pontiac had already demonstrated how vulnerable British forts could be. On the frontier, violence remained a constant threat. At the same time, colonial leaders feared slave uprisings. Revolts like the Stono Rebellion remained fresh in their minds. British troops in America were supposed to defend colonies from these threats. Instead, they occupied colonial cities. In Boston, tensions escalated quickly. Groups like the Sons of Liberty began targeting British officials. Tax collectors were harassed, some were tarred and feathered. To many colonists, it seemed they were paying British soldiers not to protect them, but to protect the tax collectors from them. You likely recognize the famous names of the Sons of Liberty: Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere, and Benedict Arnold. But you have probably never heard of Joseph Attucks, described at the time as the son of a mulatto woman. Attucks led the Sons of Liberty in New York. His story, like so many others, defies simple narratives. As the war progressed, he switched sides. He later supported the British and encouraged his son to serve in a loyalist unit in South Carolina. His life is proof that men of African descent stood on both sides of the Revolution. Crispus Attucks never flipped, however. He firmly stood with the Patriots from the beginning. Historian and retired Lieutenant Colonel Michael Lanning describes Attucks' final moments. On the night of March 5, 1770, Boston's alarm bells rang. Attucks stopped a young man leaving the scene and asked what was causing the commotion. The youth explained that a British soldier had refused to pay after receiving a haircut, and then beat the barber when he demanded his money. The situation escalated quickly. Several eyewitnesses describe what happened next. All agree that a short, stout, curly-haired black man pushed forward and urged the hesitant crowd to stand up against the soldiers. That man was Crispus Attucks. With a leader now in charge, the colonists followed Attucks to the custom house, where they threw snowballs and rocks at the buildings and its guards. The frightened sentinels called for reinforcements. Attucks, however, did not retreat. He picked up a heavy piece of firewood, shook the club at the soldiers as he dared them to fire. British Captain Thomas Preston arrived and ordered his men to hold that fire. He tried to disperse the crowd, but failed. Attucks, along with a dozen other men, advanced still closer, and the escaped slave began striking a soldier's bayonet with his stick. Then suddenly, he swung his club at Preston's head. The officer blocked the blow. In the confusion, one of his soldiers lost control of his musket. Instantly, Attucks seized the weapon. The soldier also grabbed for the gun, and the two struggled for control. The soldier slipped and fell into the icy slush. The colonists laughed. Now emboldened, they began to taunt the soldiers. "Why don't you fire?" Attucks stood before them, leaning on his stick, staring down the humiliated redcoat. But then the soldier rose, and he fired directly into Attucks' chest. A moment later, the other soldiers opened fire into the crowd. 5 men died in the Boston Massacre. At the time, Crispus Attucks' leadership was never questioned. Even John Adams, the future first vice president of the United States, placed Attucks at the center of his defense of the British soldiers in court. Adams argued that the sight of an enraged, muscular black man advancing on the soldiers justified their violent actions. He claimed the gunfire was not murder, but self-defense. By singling out Attucks as the mob's leader, Adams appealed directly to the racial prejudice of the day. Yet despite newspaper accounts and courtroom testimony that clearly identifies Attucks, his image would soon be erased. The man responsible for that was Paul Revere. His famous engraving of the Boston Massacre became one of the most powerful pieces of propaganda in American history. Historian Dave Roos explains that today Revere's bloody massacre print is included in nearly every American history textbook and is indelibly linked with the events of the Boston Massacre. But the image was not objective. It was propaganda. The historian writes that Revere's engraving was a baldly biased description of the event. Instead of a chaotic scrum with violence on both sides, it showed an organized and sneering line of British soldiers firing on unarmed innocents in response to obvious orders. Revere even altered the setting itself. The engraving added the fictional name Butcher's Hall above the custom house to further evoke the carnage in the street. But the most revealing choice was not what Paul Revere added, it was what he removed, namely Crispus Attucks. In the engraving, 5 victims lie on the ground. All are depicted as white. This is not a technical limitation. Revere clearly knew how to depict race. The boots and weapons of the British soldiers are engraved in dark, deliberate tones. One victim is even shaded green, reflecting the infection that would claim his life days later. Space was not the issue either. Revere included a dog in the foreground, carefully placed to suggest innocence. After all, no one brings a puppy to a riot. Attucks's absence was intentional. Revere understood the power of imagery. He understood unity required persuasion. A committed patriot, he likely believed that including a black victim would weaken the emotional impact of his message. And so, for the sake of unity, Crispus Attucks was removed. In doing so, Revere helped erase him from America's founding memory. The consequences of that erasure extended far beyond one engraving. It deprived generations of African American students of a founding hero, someone who stood at the very beginning of the American story. And Attucks was not alone. Black Americans appeared at nearly every major moment leading up to the conclusion of the Revolution. A free black witness testified in court that he had never heard an order for the soldiers to fire into the crowd. At Lexington and Concord, 6 black soldiers stood among the Minutemen who fired the shot heard round the world. At Bunker Hill, a black soldier named Cuff Whittemore distinguished himself in battle. According to one early historian, he fought bravely with a musket ball through his hat, and when compelled to retreat, though wounded, he seized the sword of a dead British officer. These were acts of courage. They were acts of patriotism. They were the acts of American heroes. And yet, time and again, their stories were buried in the name of unity. Even Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, confronted this tension. In his original draft of our founding document, Jefferson condemned the British Crown for its role in perpetuating the slave trade. He accused King George III of violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty by capturing and enslaving African people. Jefferson wrote that the king was determined to keep open a market where men could be bought and sold, and had blocked every attempt to end the trade. The implication was radical. In this statement, Jefferson, a slave owner himself, were admitting that Africans were human beings, that they possess the same natural rights, and the promise that all men are created equal must have applied to them as well. But that passage didn't make it into the final publication. It was removed. Leaders feared that condemning slavery would fracture the fragile alliance between the colonies. Specifically, South Carolina and Georgia, deeply dependent on slavery, might refuse to join the Revolution. Once again, unity came at the expense of truth. Thomas Paine captured this sentiment in his influential pamphlet Common Sense, writing that it is not in numbers but in unity that our great strength lies. In that, unity became the Revolution's highest priority. Even George Washington embraced that logic. As commander of the Continental Army, Washington initially banned black men, both free and enslaved, from military service. But reality soon intervened. Despite the ban, black men enlisted. They fought, they served, and they made a choice. In one of the most consequential decisions of their lives, black Americans faced a defining question. Would they fight as patriots or stand with the loyalists? This binary choice became evident when Lord Dunmore, the loyalist governor of Virginia, issued what became known as Dunmore's Proclamation. Few Americans realized that during the first year and a half of the Revolution, British reinforcements from overseas were limited. Instead, pre-war stationed redcoats rallied Loyalists, Canadians, and Native American allies to their side. As students learn when studying Washington's crossing of the Delaware, the British even hired German mercenaries, known as Hessians, to supplement their forces. As Virginia's royal governor, Dunmore acted quickly. He raised 2 military units, the Queen's own Loyal Virginia Regiment, composed of roughly 1,000 white loyalists, and the Ethiopian Regiment, an all-black fighting force. The Ethiopian Regiment was formed from approximately 300 enslaved men who escaped their masters in the war's first month. Dunmore armed them immediately and issued uniforms emblazoned with the words, "Liberty to slaves." The symbolism was intentional. Dunmore believed the sight of armed black soldiers would inspire others to flee or even rise up against their enslavers. Southern plantation owners reacted with immediate fear. One declared that Dunmore had placed a dagger at their throats, convinced the proclamation would incite widespread slave rebellion. Even British officials initially hesitated, fearing they would unleash what they described as the horrors of a slave rebellion on our American brethren. But their position quickly changed. Officials in London concluded that things are now come to that crisis, that we must avail ourselves of every resource, even to raise the Negroes in our cause. The Ethiopian Regiment never became a decisive battlefield force, as Dunmore's army was quickly pushed from the Virginia mainland and forced onto British warships. From there, they conducted coastal raids in support of British operations. When black soldiers were deployed, they were often assigned support roles, building defenses, transporting supplies, and maintaining camp infrastructure. Disease proved far more deadly than combat. In 1776, smallpox devastated the regiment, killing nearly half its soldiers. Having lived in relative isolation on plantations, many lacked immunity to the disease. Frustrated by the losses, Dunmore later wrote that had it not been for this horrid disorder, I would have had 2,000 blacks at my command. Despite its limited battlefield success, the regiment's existence had lasting consequences. Historian John Reese notes that its mere existence had far-reaching ramifications. Dunmore's motives were not humanitarian, but strategic. His decision to arm enslaved men was designed to strengthen his army and destabilize the colonial rebellion. This is evident in the fact that he retained his own enslaved laborers while allowing loyalist slaveholders to do the same. Still, his actions carried enormous political consequences. One historian observed that his offer of freedom to enslaved men alienated most of the remaining influential planters and political leaders who until then had stayed loyal to the crown. Meanwhile, George Washington faced a crisis of manpower. At the war's outset, Washington had banned black enlistment in the Continental Army, but Dunmore's proclamation forced him to reconsider. If the British offered freedom, enslaved men would naturally gravitate towards their cause. Washington could not afford to lose such a critical source of manpower, especially as recruitment consistently fell short of expectations. The shortage became so severe that boys under 15 were permitted to serve with parental consent. Among them was Andrew Jackson, who joined the American cause at just 9 years old. After his capture by British troops, Jackson refused to shine an officer's boots and was slashed across the face with a sword, a scar he carried for the rest of his life. Although Washington initially resisted widespread black enlistment, he did not expel those already serving in colonial militias. Dunmore's proclamation ultimately forced his hand. Faced with military necessity, Washington abandoned his original position and allowed black soldiers to serve in the Continental Army. This was a desperate gamble. The Americans faced the most powerful and professional military force in the world. Britain possessed trained soldiers, superior equipment, and global resources to draw from, while many American troops were farmers and laborers with minimal training and outdated weapons. They didn't even have uniforms, choosing to wear old hunting gear as a sign of who they were. Their victory seemed implausible. Even British soldiers expressed admiration for their resilience, with one redcoat writing, "I admire the American troops tremendously. It is incredible that soldiers composed of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, almost naked, unpaid, and rather poorly fed, can march so well and withstand fire so steadfastly." When combined with the Loyalist militias, Native American allies, and other forces aligned with the Crown, the odds against the American cause were staggering. By any rational calculation, few would have wagered on their success. Landing points out that states with small black populations were not as fearful of arming African Americans as those with greater numbers. All the states, regardless of population ratios, shared the difficulty of meeting enlistment quotas set by the Continental Congress after 1777. By that point, every regiment on both sides of the conflict had enlisted black soldiers or men who were there as substitutes for their masters. These soldiers were integrated into mixed-race units, rather than shunned into segregated regiments, a practice that would be implanted in every American war up to the beginning of the Second World War. John Laurens is one of the three men featured in Hamilton in the song "History Will Remember Tonight." His line in the song is about forming a black battalion. Seen as the character was casted as a black actor, it was likely viewed as a throwaway line. But the real Henry Laurens intended to do as the song suggests. A white Southern plantation owner in South Carolina, he began to free his slaves in 1775, and in 1779 advocated to Washington for 3,000 guns with which to arm black men in the Carolinas. He proclaimed that such a force would easily drive the British out of Georgia within 4 months. Hamilton supported the plan and convinced Congress to authorize the funding, but the legislation didn't attempt to require the colony to do so. In the same measure, the Congress pledged to compensate owners up to $1,000 for each slave that served well and faithfully. The slave themselves would receive their freedom for service, as well as a $50 bonus upon discharge. The severe difference in economic value showed two things. First, it demonstrated beyond a shadow of doubt that African American slaves were wealth producers. On average, a slave paid off their price within 6 months, hence the fighter being awarded a mere 5% of the money that was granted to his former master. To add further context to the $50 bonus paid to slaves who served in the Continental Army, white soldiers from Rhode Island enlisted for the promise of $4 for 6 months of service. Although they didn't ever meet in battle, the counter to Lord Dunmore's loyalist Ethiopian Regiment was the Rhode Island First. The Ocean State's decision to create an all-black fighting force evolved over time. Brothers Christopher and Nathaniel Green volunteered for service almost immediately, leading what was known as the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment into its first firefight against the German mercenary Hessian army. Although the colonists valiantly defended the outer walls, the superior Hessians advanced into the Red Bank fortifications. Then suddenly, in their moment of glory, emerged 50 hidden riflemen from the inner palisade. Their efforts swept the Germans from the fort, leaving 25 officers and 127 mercenaries killed, as well as 200 wounded. Historian William Cooper Neal directly attributed the resulting victory to the free black volunteers of the unit, writing that the glory of the defense of Red Bank, which has been pronounced one of the most heroic actions of the war, belonged in reality to black men. Unfortunately, the victory proved fleeting, and the Rhode Islanders were among those who retreated to Valley Forge. During this period, the leadership of Rhode Island wrote to General Washington expressing their concern that due to the small population size, 2 divisions stretched the colony's resources to the breaking point. Historian Robert Geek explains that, rather than just a few blacks being integrated into a handful of regiments, that an entirely black regiment be raised in Rhode Island. At the time, 9% of Rhode Island's total population had African origins. The state legislature took up the issue in February of 1778, and despite intense opposition, approved the radical plan. The expectation was that 300 or more would enlist, some of which at the behest of their owner, rather than via their own free will. Within 4 months, the reformed Rhode Island First was comprised of 225 men. While more than half were black, a large portion of the force was made up of indigenous Nagrasset natives, men descended from warriors who rose up during King Philip's War in a too late attempt to disrupt the settler colonialism process in New England. Geek explains their involvement by writing, "Those remaining in their homeland were being pushed into less desirable locations. Their native way of life as they had known it was irrevocably changed. The tribe had survived through 150 years of broken treaties, colonization, genocide, displacement, the attempted cultural assimilation of their people, as well as enslavement and the erasure of their indigenous identity." The force encountered the enemy 1 year into their service during the Battle of Rhode Island. They were accompanied by the teenage genius Marquis de Lafayette, fresh off of retraining Washington's commanders in the art of war. Their goal was to push the British off of Newport Island. Landing on Butts Island on August 9, 1778, they besieged the enemy, only to have to rethink the entire operation due to the unexpected arrival of British reinforcements. The 1st Rhode Island were charged with holding a grove essential to the organized retreat. According to research conducted by historian Samuel Green Arnold, the all-black regiment drove back the Hessians 3 times. The next year was spent patrolling the coastline, with George Washington writing that the force, as currently constructed, was too small to afford any material reinforcement, and being usefully employed where it is at present, I have thought it most advisable for it to remain. As the war progressed into 1780, the Continental Congress pressed each state to provide more troops. Rhode Island, as expected, struggled to meet its quota. Of the 500 men assembled, 160 were boys under the age of 18, along with 35 African Americans and 28 Native Americans. Persistent shortages eventually forced the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment to merge with the 1st. Yet the consolidation did nothing to diminish the striking image of men of different races marching together in common cause. One of Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau's generals observed that the majority of these enlisted men are Negroes or mulattoes, strong, robust men. Those I saw made a good appearance. Desertion plagued the Continental Army throughout the war. Nearly 1/3 of its soldiers abandoned their posts at some point during the conflict. The rate was significantly lower among black soldiers. Historian Benjamin Quarles explains that Negroes were less inclined than white soldiers to walk off without official leave. They were not likely to have a farm that needed protection, nor the kind of home that inspired homesickness. They had less to desert to. In fact, the majority of black soldiers serving in the Rhode Island regiments remained for 5 full years, a remarkable commitment given the hardships they endured. Little attention has been paid to the integrated nature of these units, where black and white soldiers lived, marched, and fought side by side. Such integration would not appear again in the United States military until nearly 2 centuries later, when Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, formally desegregating the armed forces near the end of World War II. My own state of South Carolina highlights the sacrifice of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment during the Civil War. These black soldiers served under a white colonel who treated them with dignity and respect. Though their assault on Fort Wagner ended in defeat, their courage proved beyond question that African Americans could fight as effectively as any white soldier when given proper training and leadership. Yet focusing only on the 54th Massachusetts creates the false impression that this was the first time black Americans had demonstrated such valor. That lesson had already been taught during the Revolution. We just forgot about it. One of the war's overlooked heroes, Christopher Green, was guarded by an elite detachment composed entirely of black soldiers. Historian Henry Wetzeck notes that there is no record of a popular outcry against the presence of black soldiers, no record of fights or disciplinary problems caused by racial integration. The common white New England soldier seems to have accepted blacks. The objections to the black presence came not from the rank and file, but from the highest levels of policymakers and politicians. Historian William Cooper Neal adds that among the traits which distinguished the black regiment was devotion to their officers. Colonel Green, the commander of the regiment, was cut down and mortally wounded, but the sabers of the enemy only reached him through the bodies of his faithful guard of blacks, who hovered over him to protect him, and every one of whom was killed with him. Yet these lessons, these sacrifices, were totally left in the past. The example set during the Revolution faded from national memory. The heroism of the 54th Massachusetts was likewise ignored when black soldiers were sent to Europe in segregated units during World War I. The popular narrative suggests that African American citizenship was finally earned through the Double V campaign, and through the battlefield success of units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the Harlem Hellfighters. Their bravery was undeniable, but the truth was far older. Black Americans had already proven their loyalty, their courage, and their worth on the battlefields of the American Revolution itself. The Black Battalion from Rhode Island even played a role in the final battle of the Revolution, Yorktown. Given a place of prominence under the command of Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, they were ordered to storm one of the remaining British fortifications. These soldiers struck one of the first decisive blows in the battle that would end the war. Their courage helped seal American independence. Yet despite their example, few other colonies followed Rhode Island's lead in forming black battalions. When the fighting ended, new questions emerged. What would happen to the black men and women who had fought for their freedom? The British, even in defeat, honored their promises. They evacuated thousands of black loyalists, men, women, and children, to free territories throughout the empire. Many resettled in Canada, where they began new lives beyond the reach of American slavery. Some black soldiers who served in the Continental Army were granted their freedom, but others were not so fortunate. A man named Prince, who had served honorably in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, was re-enslaved after his former owner successfully argued in court that Prince's legal residence had been Massachusetts, where Rhode Island's emancipation promises did not apply. For many African Americans, independence brought new forms of injustice. Geek writes that the Constitution ratified in 1789 gave slaveholders a disproportionate representation in the House of Representatives and Electoral College. allowed the importation of slaves into southern states for another 2 decades, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 protected those slaveholders whose runaways sought freedom in the North. Freedom, in theory, existed, but in practice it remained out of reach for many. Property ownership became a prerequisite for political participation, yet most black veterans emerging from slavery and war possessed neither wealth nor land. The legal system itself became a weapon. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed magistrates to issue arrest warrants for any black person accused of being a runaway, often based solely on the accusation of a slaveholder. This created an environment ripe for abuse. Historian Ira Berlin notes that kidnappers in the free states and slave traders in the slave states conspired to spirit away hundreds, perhaps thousands of black men and women. Many who had once worn the uniform of the Continental Army now lived under constant threat of capture and enslavement. Protections came slowly and often too late. Some northern states eventually passed liberty laws to protect free black citizens from kidnapping. Rhode Island, however, did not enact such protections until 1848, long after many of its black veterans had died. In the years immediately following the war, most former black soldiers could not vote unless they owned property. They earned lower wages than their white counterparts and were barred from militia service. Though they had helped secure liberty for the nation, they themselves remained excluded from its full promise. Their service had freed them from slavery, but it left many in a legal and social limbo, caught between freedom and inequality. Thus, while we must restore black men and women to their rightful place in the story of the American Revolution, we must also confront a difficult truth. In the defining choice of the era, serve England or serve America, many who risked their lives for American liberty did not receive its rewards. In the end, those who fought most bravely for freedom were often the ones who benefited least from its victory. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.